Since the dawn of civilization, anytime a society has had above replacement fertility, it's always been enabled by some form of coercion. When I say coercion, I'm not trying to moralize. I mean it in a very specific, objective way. Above replacement fertility has required a society to force the costs of reproduction onto a group of people who has no easy way to opt out of paying those costs, while also having no way to limit births, while a different group with more agency is incentivized to want more children. It's incentive alignment through separation. The people who effectively decide how many children will be born are not the same people paying most of the costs of raising those children. That's the core mechanism. Pronatalist coercion tends to come in three major flavors. The first one, structural oppression of women while men are incentivized to want lots of children. The second one is heavy taxpayer-funded subsidy of parents and children. And the third one is externalizing the cost onto some other group of people who can't say no. Examples of this include human trafficking or coerced or trapped migrant workers exploited for cheap domestic labor, exploiting workers in some other country through unequal trade arrangements, or foreign subsidies or aid funded by taxpayers in another country who have no way to meaningfully opt out of that, often because their institutions are captured or they've lost control of their government. I mentioned these dynamics before in my game theory of dating video, and at least a couple of the comments made it seem like people thought I was offering these three forms of coercion as policy recommendations for reversing fertility decline. That was not my intention. I didn't really express any judgments about it in that video, but today I'm going to explain why coercion is not going to solve this problem. If there is a takeaway from this realization, it's not, here are three potential solutions to human fertility decline. It's that fertility decline is a symptom of a much bigger and older problem. A lot of people look at human history and interpret it as a success story because we exploded in number, covered the planet, built empires, and achieved impressive technological advances. So I understand that it can be tempting to look at all of that and conclude that we were doing great up until very recently, and now we just have this one weird little fertility problem that we can patch, and then once we figure that out, everything's going to be awesome again. But that's exactly why no one has come up with a real solution to the problem of fertility decline. The problem is the assumption that we can keep the rest of the system the same and just tweak birth rates without affecting our economic system or anything else. The thing is that our social systems have been deeply dysfunctional for a very long time, and we're only now being forced to face that because up until recently, the dysfunction was masked by coercion and extraction. By forcing some people to carry the costs for everyone else, and by chewing through our planet like it was an infinite credit card and the bill would never come due. We never solved the problem of how to build a livable and sustainable system that could support us and our descendants in perpetuity. We just kicked the can down the road and externalized the costs onto humans and ecosystems that could not say no. As you can probably imagine, I have moral objections to coercion. But moral arguments are not convincing to people whose comfort and status depend on not being persuaded by them. As Upton Sinclair put it, it is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it. So, moralizing aside, the bigger and more undeniable problem here is that a civilization that relies on coercion and extraction to reproduce itself is not sustainable. Most of us already understand the ecological side of this. You can't run an infinite growth system on a finite planet forever. Exploitation of humans also has a limit, though. Coercive systems are inherently unstable, and they inevitably fall apart eventually. Slavery seems like it would be the most stable form of coercion because the people being exploited have almost no autonomy and very little leverage. But systems like that require constant control, punishment, and fear just to keep people from escaping or rebelling. Also, total control of someone is expensive. If you really want to strip people of autonomy, you have to take on responsibility for their entire upkeep. Their housing, food, health, and supervision all become your logistics problem. If you don't want to carry that load, you have to hand some of that responsibility back to them. And the moment you do that, you also give people more room to organize and push back. The same autonomy that saves you work also gives them leverage. Something else that isn't talked about much is that even the people who benefit from exploitation are psychologically harmed by it. The mechanism is called cognitive dissonance. In a general sense, it's the discomfort that arises when your beliefs don't align with observable reality. One way that it manifests is when your own actions don't line up with what you believe about yourself. I'm not going to make any claim about people being inherently good or evil deep down, because there's no way to measure or prove that. What we can observe, though, is that most people work very hard to see themselves as good, or at least justified in whatever actions they take. We want to believe that whatever we're doing is reasonable and necessary, or at the very least, that it's the best option in a bad situation. You can see this even in cases where someone has done something undeniably harmful. If you ask them why, they almost always have a story in which they weren't the villain. They were defending their family. They were following the rules. They were enforcing order. They had no choice for one reason or another. In their version of events, they're still the hero, or at the very least, the responsible adult doing what had to be done. So anyway, when people take actions that don't line up with their beliefs, ideally, they would relieve the cognitive dissonance that arises as a result of that by admitting to themselves that they have done something that violates their own morals and vowing to be more careful about their actions in the future. You'd want to learn from your mistakes and then forgive yourself and move on with the best of intentions, but that's not typically what happens. If someone takes an action that violates their morals or beliefs, and that action was necessary to ensure their survival or otherwise meet their needs, and they know they'll have to keep doing those kinds of things in the future to ensure continued survival or meet future needs, usually what happens is that people change their beliefs to justify their actions. To justify the exploitation of others, people adopt beliefs like, those people deserve it because they're inferior in some way, or life isn't fair, or it's unfortunate that I have to do this, but it enables me to keep doing something good that outweighs the harm I'm causing. So the ends justify the means. Or this person would do the same thing to me if they had the chance. Typically, the closer and more visible the person being exploited is, and the more extreme and unjust the harm is, the more absurd and logically incoherent the justification for it is going to be. Just for an example, people know that buying items made in a sweatshop in some other country is unethical, and that they're harming people when they do this. But the victims of that are not very close or visible, and the harm is undeniable, but at the same time, it's not that extreme compared to other kinds of harm. So usually the justification is something like, well, I needed that item, and it was the only one I could afford, and I didn't really have any better options. And they don't think too much harder about it. But when the harm is something really extreme, like selling one of your children as a child bride for some old guy to marry so that the rest of your family can have money to buy food, you're going to probably have some way crazier story to justify that. Like, there's some disembodied omnipotent force that rules over all of existence who condones this, and he made all of us and everything else, so who are we to disagree with what he says is good and correct to do? Anyway, when you zoom out to the level of a whole society, you can understand why a system that requires these kinds of beliefs wouldn't last forever. Parents try to pass on their beliefs to their kids, and institutions try to reinforce cultural norms, but every generation is born new, with the same basic drive to see themselves as the good guy in their own story. And each generation is also born into a slightly different world with a slightly different menu of options for how they can survive. So even if one generation is so traumatized that they fully buy into the story that exploitation is necessary and justified, Their children could grow up looking at a different landscape, and if they can see a way to meet their needs while causing less obvious harm, most of them will reach for that because it's easier on their self-image, because it doesn't require them to lie to themselves. Over time, as more alternatives appear, the pressure adds up and it becomes harder and harder to keep every new generation fully invested in the story that the old level of coercion is acceptable or inevitable. That's my theory on that anyway. So let's look at the 3 forms of coercion I talked about and why they're not an answer. The first one, structural oppression of women while men are incentivized to want many children, only reliably works in settings like subsistence agriculture, where children can be exploited as an economic asset. And the only way to bring that back would be to bring back conditions in which men materially profit from having many children and where women are essentially the property of men. Most people don't actually want that world. It's a hard sell because it's not just women who lose in a system like that. Children also lose when they're treated primarily as economic units. Exploiting children for profit wouldn't have to simply be an option. It would have to be the only option. The second one is heavy public subsidy of parents and children by taxpayers. The problem with this one is that you're talking about taking from the wealthy to pay for the poor and the children of the poor. It's very hard to remove enough agency from the people paying to make this stable long term. The wealthy typically have disproportionate influence. If a subsidy becomes meaningfully expensive and redistributive, they'll find ways to stop paying. They will elect leaders who dismantle the policies, or they'll lobby and bribe the politicians. They'll find ways to get out of paying by exploiting loopholes or offshoring money. So even if it can work temporarily, it's not structurally stable long term. The third form of coercion was externalizing the costs onto people who can't say no. This is the most viable in the narrow sense that the incentives can line up for a while because the extracted from group inherently has low agency. But it's still not stable forever, and it's not infinitely scalable either. Eventually you run out of people to exploit, especially because exploitation itself tends to lower fertility in the exploited population. You can't extract more and more from fewer and fewer working age people forever. Human trafficking is difficult to sustain long term at scale because it's widely recognized as a grave human rights violation, and there are limits to what you can get away with openly. Exploiting another country through trade imbalance is also not indefinitely sustainable. The United States' exploitation of the global South in the last century is an example of this. It didn't work forever. Over time, the countries being exploited develop their economies, the power balance shifts, and people push back. You can keep moving the exploitation to other countries, but eventually you'll run out of countries with enough poor and desperate people who are willing to work for basically nothing. Foreign aid is another example, depending on how it's structured and enforced, including through installed or captured governments. But people can overthrow their governments, and also, if your own population is growing because you're propping it up through extraction, the required extraction grows and eventually becomes more than the country you're exploiting can even pay. It's not a magical, never-ending fountain of labor and resources. The exploited population also ages. They end up with more elderly people than young people, and so you're trying to take more and more from fewer and fewer productive workers. Never mind that there's no way a system like this could be the answer for the entire species. It's not a system in which everyone can win. One country's gain is another country's loss. One person's cheap domestic worker is another person's life spent doing work that they never get to benefit from. One side of that equation will increase their fertility, while the other side will see theirs reduced. Anyway, I hope that explains why I don't recommend any of these 3 forms of coercion as policies to reverse fertility decline. As for what could work to reverse fertility decline, I have some ideas about that, but that's going to be a different video. If you made it this far, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you have any thoughts about this or ideas for what you think could work to reverse fertility decline, please leave a comment. I love reading your comments.